What's your philosophy? This is yet another question philosophers face that demonstrates a misunderstanding of what philosophy is. A philosophy is thought to be just a theory or approach. Used car dealers can have a philosophy to never be undersold. But philosophy itself is an academic discipline, and we shouldn't confuse the two. However, when doing philosophy, you're likely going to develop a philosophy or two. You'll develop theories. But a good theory is only as good as the reasoning behind it. And without good reasons, it's worthless. In fact, few will be as ruthless as philosophers in demanding that you present reasons for your beliefs. That's the only way to get to the truth, what philosophers seek above all else. But there are legitimate concerns regarding how much we should trust reason. After all, when one presents reasons for a position, one is just presenting an argument, a collection of statements or premises intended to support a conclusion. But arguments are given by people on both sides of every issue. And people on opposite sides of an issue can't both be right. If one person says that something is true and another person says that it's false, well, then one is right and the other one is wrong. So only one of their arguments is reliable. On average, it might seem that using reason only gets you to the truth about 50% of the time. And if that's the case, reasoning is no better than a coin toss. We might as well flip a quarter to figure out what we should believe. Worse still, the arguments that people present usually just reflect their biases. People don't reason to conclusions. They just believe what they want because it's comfortable or confirms other desired beliefs or it aligns with tradition. Their argument is just their way of trying to rationalize what they want to believe. And there is almost no limit to how far they'll go. They will twist reasoning, distort statistics, ignore facts, and just outright lie. Of course, we'd like to think that this isn't true of us, that we reason to our conclusions. But we're all human. We're all apt to make these mistakes. Worse still, we often just let others do our rationalizing for us. We seek out arguments, but only pay attention to the arguments and evidence that confirm what we already believe. Let's be honest. I'm this way, you're this way. We love to hear people that agree with us. We like it when people tell us what we want to hear, that our beliefs are true. We like it even more when people give arguments that confirm what we already believe and make people who disagree with us look like idiots. Although some people will deny this up and down, there's no sense lying to ourselves about it. It's just you and me here. This is why conservatives watch Fox News and liberals watch MSNBC. Each spins a narrative that confirms the worldview of their viewers. And living in an echo chamber where people repeat back to you what you already believe, it's very, well, it's comforting. But even as we watch, deep down, we know the arguments aren't good. We know they're biased. They're ignoring facts, presenting only one side. Obviously, they wouldn't convince anyone who didn't already agree. I'm reminded of a particularly egregious example of biased reasoning from when the Bush tax cuts were set to expire. The tax rate was 35%, and letting the tax cut expire would raise the tax to around 40%. But to show this, someone made a graph that started at 34%. This made it look like letting the tax cut expire would result in a 5-fold increase in taxes and revenues, a full 500%. If they'd started the graph at 0, the difference wouldn't seem as dramatic. And with some historical context, the difference would be barely noticeable. After all, it's only a 5% increase, and the highest marginal tax rate was 94% after World War II. This is a classic bit of argument sleight of hand. Using graphs and charts to misrepresent data is one of the oldest tricks in the book. Yet, we love to eat it up. Think about it. How would you react if that story appeared on MSNBC and they were trying to exaggerate how much letting the Bush tax cuts expire would generate in government revenue for things like education? But what if instead it appeared on Fox News and they were trying to exaggerate how it was going to increase unemployment by taking away money from job creators? What would you have thought in each case? If you're like me, you'd probably think one was a dirty liar and the other one had a good point. But in reality, it's a deceitful trick, no matter how you slice it. The fact that we would react in this biased way is indicative of something called confirmation bias, a tendency to interpret information in a way that confirms our preconceptions. Unfortunately, we're all subject to it. This is why, even when presented with irrefutable evidence, people will often further entrench themselves in their original view, rather than change their mind. So it seems people just don't trust arguments and evidence. They don't trust reason. But perhaps that's not too surprising given the kinds of arguments people give and how poor our reasoning skills are. For example, during the Red Scare of the 1950s, fear of communism was at its height. Senator Joe McCarthy was convinced that communists had infiltrated the government, and so he held his famous McCarthy hearings. He accused literally hundreds, some say even thousands, of people of being communist sympathizers. Few had any sympathy for communism at all, yet dozens of politicians lost their credibility and more than 2,000 government employees lost their job. What was his argument? In a nutshell, it was this: if you can't prove that you're not a communist, then you are. And people ate it up. For years, McCarthy was bulletproof. If you even questioned his tactics, motivation, or reasoning, you were a suspected communist. And if he accused you and you weren't able to completely disprove it, everyone believed you were a communist. But let's look at that line of reasoning. If you can't prove you're not a communist, then you are. Could you prove you're not a secret communist? Sure, maybe you go to church, vote Republican, and signed an anti-communist oath, but isn't that just what a secret communist would do to throw everyone off the track? This line of reasoning, commonly called appealing to ignorance, is one of the most fallacious bits of reasoning there is. Since complete proof that something is false is usually impossible, a lack of proof against something is not a good reason to conclude that it's true. Likewise, since proof for something being true can be equally hard to come by, the mere fact that you can't prove something true is not good reason to conclude that it is false. Perhaps the fallaciousness of such reasoning is most obvious when you realize that if it were valid, we'd be justified in believing just about anything. As we shall soon see, it's nearly impossible to prove anything. Appealing to ignorance could make believing that the earth is flat rational, simply because it can't 100% be disproven. The same holds true for sufficient evidence. The mere fact that we don't have sufficient evidence against something is not a good reason to think it's true, or vice versa. We have to be careful here. If the evidence for something's truth would be obvious if it were true, then not finding such evidence is a good reason to think that it is false. The fact that we don't have evidence for a second moon orbiting the Earth is good reason to conclude that there isn't one, because if there were, we would have seen it. But evidence that you are not a secret communist is not like this. Everything you could do to prove that you are not a communist is something a communist could also do to hide their allegiance. So the evidence that you are not a secret communist could never be seen. Another exception to the rule kicks in when you're dealing with questions of existence. A lack of something's evidence for something's existence is reason to doubt that it exists, even if you wouldn't have evidence for it if it existed. Philosophers agree that when it comes to debating the existence of something, the burden of proof lies on the believer. If you want to believe that something exists, it's your job to provide good evidence that it exists. To use an example made famous by the Cambridge philosopher Bertrand Russell in a piece deemed too controversial for publication by the magazine Illustrated in 1952, if I want to believe that a tiny teapot orbits the sun between Earth and Mars, It's my responsibility to provide the evidence. The fact that you can't disprove the hypothesis, say because the teapot is too tiny to see even with the telescope, doesn't mean that my belief in the teapot is rational. It's not your job to prove that it doesn't exist. It's my job to prove that it does. And until I do, your disbelief is justified and my belief is unwarranted. Of course, whether or not someone is a secret communist is not an existential matter, so this exception didn't apply to McCarthy's arguments. My point is, McCarthy's arguments were clearly, unequivocally bad, and yet everyone thought they were good. It wasn't until he targeted the armed services and the hearing was televised that people stopped listening to him. But even then, it was only because people no longer liked McCarthy, not because they recognized the fallaciousness of his argument. The defining moment of the trial was when the Army's lawyer accused McCarthy of being cruel and reckless. When McCarthy continued his attack, the lawyer interrupted. "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?" McCarthy's popularity disappeared overnight. There's one variety of the appeal to ignorance fallacy that I see pretty much daily. I call it the mystery, therefore magic fallacy. It's when someone thinks that their inability to prove that something has a natural explanation is a good reason to invoke a supernatural explanation. Because, how else do you explain it? Interestingly, we don't always make this mistake. We avoid it every time we see a magician perform a trick that we can't explain. For example, I've seen Penn and Teller live twice, once in Vegas and once in New York. And I have no idea, for example, how they catch bullets in their teeth. But I don't really think they are catching bullets in their teeth or that they have magic powers. After all, what's the better explanation for why I can't find a natural explanation? That there isn't one because they really are magic? Or I'm just not as clever as I think I am? That I'm ignorant, that I'm easily misled and bad at finding explanations? And yet, if it involves a supernatural phenomenon of their choice, people will swallow this line of reasoning hook, line, and sinker. You can't explain what I saw in the sky? Well, then it was an alien craft. You can't explain what I saw in the dark, mysterious house? Well, then it was a ghost. You can't explain why my disease went into remission? Well, then it was a miracle. Countless people invoke such reasoning every day, and yet it is no more reasonable than believing that magicians have magic powers. Of course, this is not the only fallacious line of reasoning people embrace. Consider, for example, when two things are correlated, when they happen at the same time, or one right before the other. What do we conclude? That one causes the other, right? Yet such reasoning is often fallacious. Correlation does not entail causation. Night always comes before day, but night doesn't cause day. Both are the effects of the Earth's rotation. The rate of violent crime always increases when ice cream sales increase. But ice cream does not cause or induce violence. The correlation is simply due to a common third factor, both spike in the summer. The correlation could also just be a coincidence. For example, in 1978, sports reporter Leonard Koppett noticed a correlation between whether an NFL or an AFL team won the Super Bowl and then whether the stock market went up or down the next year. And the correlation largely held for the first 30 years. But of course, there was no real cause and effect. Ironically, Koppett was trying to point out the fallaciousness of such thinking. But people still fell for it. That's just how bad at reasoning we are. Such reasoning can even be dangerous. For example, autism has been diagnosed in some children shortly after they received the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. But that doesn't mean that vaccines cause autism. It's simply the case that the age at which children's immune system are developed enough to receive the vaccine, well, that's around the same time that diagnosable signs of autism begin to appear. Yet, people have still concluded that vaccines are to blame and have stopped vaccinating their children. Consequently, many preventable diseases that were once all but eradicated are on the rise again. Such people are so convinced that nothing seems to be able to dissuade them. Not only have studies claiming the link been discredited, and not only have autism rates continued to rise, despite the fact that the suspected culprit thimerosal was removed from the vaccine, and not only have studies showed that the rates of autism are the same among vaccinated and unvaccinated children, but doctors can often detect signs of autism before the administration of the MMR vaccine. What more proof do you need? And yet, when you point all this out, some people will still just say, but I know someone who got vaccinated and then was diagnosed with autism. Again, correlation does not entail causation. I know someone who put on a shirt and then was hit by a car. That doesn't mean anything. A correlation between two things might, maybe, be a reason to investigate whether there is a causal link between them. But once the investigation is done, if you don't find a link, that's it. Game over. Sometimes the fact that an argument is bad is staring us right in the face, and yet we still fall for it. For example, sometimes people argue in a circle. They assume the truth of what they're trying to prove. The conclusion of their argument is simply stated or assumed by one of the premises of their argument. But if I would have to already think your conclusion is true, to think that your premises are true, well, then you really haven't established anything. You can't establish something by assuming it. This is called begging the question. For example, take this argument. I know that everything in the Quran is true because it says it right there in the Quran. Everything written in the Quran is true. You were probably quick to notice the problem here. You'd only find this argument convincing if you already believe the Quran is true, which is what the argument is trying to establish. So it doesn't really prove anything. But you may not have been so quick to notice the error had I quoted the Bible to establish that everything in the Bible is true, or if I had quoted the Declaration's Independence self-evident truth clause to prove its claims are true. And that's the point. We usually let our emotions or preconceptions tell us whether an argument is bad. They do our reasoning for us. Or consider these two arguments, and hang on because things might get a little controversial. Argument 1. Every life is sacred. A fetus is alive. Therefore, a fetus is sacred. Argument 2. Everyone has a moral right to choose. A woman can choose to have an abortion. Thus, a woman has a moral right to choose an abortion. Now, chances are you thought one of these arguments was rock solid and that the other one was clearly poor. But the truth is, they both make the same mistake. And it's the same one that this argument makes. Argument 3. Bologna's better than nothing, and nothing's better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna is better than prime rib. This is called equivocation, switching the meanings of terms from one premise to the next so that it looks like the premises are true and that the conclusion follows, when in fact it does not. Take the third argument. Bologna is better than nothing. Is that true? Well, sure, but the word nothing in that premise means something totally different than it does in the next premise. Nothing is better than prime rib. Notice how obvious the mistake is when we clarify. Having bologna to eat is better than having no food to eat at all. There is no single kind of food that is better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna is better than prime rib? Clearly, that doesn't follow. Now, perhaps you noticed that mistake in argument 3 from the get-go. But that's because you didn't agree with the conclusion, so you immediately turned a critical eye to the argument. The same thing likely happened with either argument 1 or argument 2. You didn't like the conclusion, so you went searching for a problem. But maybe you didn't do this with the other argument because you liked its conclusion. Still, again, both arguments made the same mistake. Sure, every life is sacred and a fetus is alive, but a fetus being alive doesn't make it a life. Bacteria are alive, but we don't think that the life of a bacterium is sacred. The word life in premise 1 is really talking about persons, whereas premise 2 is only talking about biological function. Again, clarification makes the mistake obvious. Consider the clarified argument. all persons are sacred, a fetus exhibits some biological functions, thus a fetus is sacred. Doesn't follow. We could change premise 2 to make the argument valid. We could say that all fetuses are persons, but then that premise is much more controversial. No one's going to accept that premise unless they're already pro-life. So that would just make the argument circular. The mistake in argument 2 is similar. It equivocates between choose and choice. Premise 1 is a moral platitude that we think is true, but it also has an unstated limit. We don't have a moral right to make any choice. Premise 2, however, is about a particular choice, but it tells us nothing about whether or not that choice falls inside or outside the moral platitude. Notice how obviously bad the argument is if we switch one choice for another. Everyone has a moral right to choose. A woman can choose to steal a car. Thus, a woman has the moral right to steal a car. The mistake is obvious. And hopefully, it's also obvious that I'm not trying to come down on one side of the abortion issue here. I'm just pointing out how bad our reasoning can be, no matter who you are or which side of the issue you find yourself. Another favorite example of mine is the slippery slope fallacy, a fallacy that people are so immune to that they often identify it as they commit it. We can't legalize gay marriage. It's a slippery slope. Pretty soon polygamy will be legal. Or we can't allow the 10 Commandments to be displayed at the courthouse. It's a slippery slope. Pretty soon the laws of Leviticus will be the laws of the land. The mere fact that one step will put you closer to some outcome doesn't mean that outcome will be reached. When I step out of my office, I'm one step closer to Florida, but that doesn't mean I'm going to end up there. Each step should be evaluated on its own merits, not upon other steps that might hypothetically be taken later. Now, some slopes may, in fact, be slippery. For example, limited military engagements can draw a military into larger conflicts, and the long-term consequences of an action can be a reason to avoid it. But simply saying it's a slippery slope doesn't make it true. Simply stating an action's possible consequences doesn't mean that it will have that consequence. You must provide evidence that it will have that consequence. After all, the same slippery slope to polygamy argument was used against interracial marriage 50 years ago. And it's important to note, the fallaciousness of these arguments doesn't tell us about whether or not the truth of their conclusion. Maybe the 10 Commandments shouldn't be displayed at the courthouse, but it's not because doing so is going to lead to the police arresting me for eating a cheeseburger. And this brings us back to our original question. If our reasoning is so unreliable, then why should we trust reason? Even if we construct an argument ourselves, couldn't we have still knowingly committed a fallacy? After all, if we like the conclusion we're reasoning to, aren't we likely to ignore the deficiencies our argument has? There are a few things to say about this. First of all, regardless of whether we should trust reason, we can't do without it. We reason about everything, both consciously and unconsciously. Even when you eat, you do so because you think that you need to survive, or because your past experience has taught you that it will cure your hunger. Although having a reason and reason itself are not the same thing, anytime you do something for a reason, you are using reasoning. You draw the conclusion that you should do that thing for that reason. In fact, what has led us to wonder whether we should trust reason is reason itself. All along, I've been presenting an argument that goes something like this. Reasoning doesn't seem to be reliable. I should not trust unreliable things, therefore I should not trust reasoning. So, ironically, the argument to not trust reason actually refutes itself. If the upshot of that line of reasoning is true, and I shouldn't trust reasoning, then I shouldn't trust that line of reasoning. But we can find an even better example or answer to our question by delineating two different kinds of reasoning. First, there is instinctive reasoning, the kind we employ when we look at an argument and let our feelings dictate its worth. This kind of reasoning is not reliable. But there is also conscious or careful reasoning, where we learn the rules of logic, acquaint ourselves with common mistakes of instinctive reasoning, and then carefully construct or evaluate arguments, doing our best to guard against the mistakes we are prone to make. This kind of reasoning is very reliable. It lies at the heart of philosophy and science and is responsible for every bit of progress we have made as a species. Instinctive reasoning processes are not reliable because they're automatic responses we develop through evolution. And evolution only selects what makes you better able to survive and reproduce. And that's not always true belief. Here's a classic example to illustrate that point. Suppose one of our primate ancestors hears a rustle in the bushes. The primate who jumps to the conclusion that it's a living thing out to get him will run away. This may be an unjustified conclusion, but it preserves his life on the off chance that the thing in the bushes is a tiger. But the primate who rationally concludes that he does not have enough information to know what caused the noise remains agnostic and won't run away. This actually is the justified conclusion, but on the off chance that it is a tiger, this will not preserve his life. This is perhaps how the anthropomorphic bias arose, our tendency to ascribe agency to non-living things like the wind and lightning and weather and computers, which seem to have it out for me, and strange noises in the dark. Back when we had to struggle to survive, we didn't have the time to reason carefully. We had to jump to conclusions to survive. It was easier to conclude that correlated things are causally related. On the off chance that the slope is slippery, that a first step would lead to some disastrous conclusion, well, it was just safer to assume that the slope was slippery. And solidifying your place in the group by just believing what everyone else believed made you more likely to find a mate. Of course, these methods of reasoning are not safer or better for us now. Avoiding vaccines because of supposed correlation with autism can cost your children their lives. Slippery slope arguments often hold back social progress. And large groups can be very wrong. Think of how tragically wrong those in Salem were about the existence of witches. Fortunately, however, evolution also gave us something else: large brains. And our large brains are capable of careful reasoning. They can learn logic and recognize the mistakes of instinctive reasoning and avoid them. They can examine evidence, find the best explanation, and come to justified conclusions. Now, it's not clear whether we evolved bigger brains because they gave us the ability to reason carefully. After all, acquiring true beliefs can be very helpful for survival. On the other hand, our capacity to reason carefully could be what's called a spandrel, an accidental flourish. Perhaps we evolved larger brains because they made us better able to throw spears and hunt game, but they just so happen to also give us the capacity to reason carefully. Regardless, we've got them. And it is because of our bigger brains and careful reasoning that we've been able to advance so significantly, both technologically and in our understanding of the world. So, should we trust reason? Honestly, most of the time, we shouldn't trust instinctive reasoning. It's just not that reliable. It occasionally gets things right, but it always needs to be checked by careful reasoning, which can, in general, be trusted. It, in fact, is responsible for our advancement as a species. That's not to say that it's perfect. Even the most careful reasoning can get things wrong, but it doesn't have to be perfect to be trustworthy. We should never forget, however, that it can still go wrong. This is why you always want to check your careful reasoning for flaws. Make sure that no fallacious instinctive reasoning slipped in. Try to find errors. Even look for evidence that you're wrong. After all, how hard is it to confirm your beliefs if that's all you're trying to do? Anyone can find some evidence for anything. If you want to prove yourself right, try to prove yourself wrong. Because if you try to prove yourself wrong and can't, it's a really good indication that you're right. Want to be even more assured? Invite others to prove you wrong. And remember, admit it when you are wrong. But knowing that we can trust careful reasoning only does us good if we know how to reason carefully. So how do we reason carefully? Well, the first step is learning to recognize and avoid the ways that instinctive reasoning can lead us astray. And we've just discussed quite a few. Gut thinking, confirmation bias, appealing to ignorance, the correlation fallacy, begging the question, equivocation. I encourage you to look up more. Do a web search on informal logical fallacies. But to really know how to reason carefully, we have to learn the rules of logic, the science of reasoning itself. Fortunately, we can stand on the shoulders of giants in this regard. Careful reasoning has been coveted by philosophers for centuries, and the rules of logic and reasoning are, in most cases, very well defined. Learning those rules will help us understand and answer our next question: how do we reason carefully?